Using CoreData in your SwiftUI app and want to add an item to your app published array, well, this is the perfect way to do it. What I'm going to do is make a function called add tab because my entire app relies on a tab view, which is dependent on my array. So to add my item, I'm just making a constant called new tab, and I'm using the name of the entity in my CoreData file, which is tab model data, and then I'm specifying the context. And if you don't remember, this container is the same that we declared at the top of our view model. And after that, I'm just changing the properties of this new tab. So I'm changing the main value to 0, I'm changing the name to just say name, I'm changing the increment to 10, having it reset to false, and then having the background color as blue. And after I'm doing all that, all I have to do is just save my data. And so what this is going to do is add this screen to the end of my array. And we can kind of just break this down into saving the data at the end, changing the values of our new tab in the middle, and then creating the new tab at the very beginning. Happy coding! If you're using a tab view in your SwiftUI app, you probably want to add a way for your users to add a tab. And I made the logic for this in the last video, but today what I'm going to do is make the UI components. And for that, I'm heading to my home screen view, and I have this tab view, as you can see, and I have all the data at the very top. And this isn't an extension, but basically just think of this as all of the existing screens. And then after that, what I'm going to do is add in my Z stack, which has just a radial gradient and a button, which is a circle, and it has some basic modifiers that we've already covered previously. And then in the logic for that button, I'm just going to add the function that I made last time. And my tab view is binded to the selected tab variable, which basically helps us see which tab the user is on. And I want this screen to be able to add a new tab to always be at the very end. And so for that, I'm going to add a .tag modifier, and I'm going to set the value to vm.tabModelArray.count. And this works because indexes start at 0. So if there's like 3 screens already, then the count will be 3, but the first 3 screens will be assigned values of 0, 1, and 2. So this would be at the very end. And the same thing will happen as more screens are added. And we're going to see how this looks in the next row. Happy coding? Is this going to work? Is what I was thinking as I ran my app, because over the last couple of reels with you guys, I've made a lot of changes to my code to be able to add tabs to my current tab view. And so basically this means that my user will be able to add screens in my app. And so it's loading, and when we open it up, we can see that we have the add page, and when we click it, it works. And so what this means is that whenever the user is going to click this add page button, it'll move to the end of the tab view, and the user will be directed to the screen that was just made, which will be made the second last tab. And so I'm really happy to see that this is working, but I still have a lot of work to do because my entire settings page has no logic components, meaning that you guys can see it here, but it doesn't work. So be sure to join me in coding all of that in the future. Happy coding! When you're designing an app, do you make the UI components first, or do you make the logic components first? I personally like to make the UI components first because I want to know exactly what I'm going to need for my logic, but that sometimes means that I need to make changes along the way. For example, before in my settings page, I was just passing in a specific instance of my tab model, and that allowed me to get all the things that I needed to create the UI. But I realized that eventually I'm going to be needing to pass in my view model, and I'm going to be needing to make changes to the page that the user is currently on. And so it makes more sense to just pass in the index instead. So to fix this, all I have to do is wherever I had current page, I just need to replace that with vm.tabModelArray, and then just use that index value to get the specific screen that the user is on. And so it's a simple change, and it's not going to do anything right now, but I do need to just also make that change where I'm calling my settings page, and I'm going to be able to use that index value to make changes to whatever screen the user is on as we develop the logic further. Happy coding! Do you have outdated functions in your code? Well, as I'm making my app, I realized that I have this function called return model at index, and I don't really need it anymore, and I'm not using it anywhere. So I'm taking that out, but what I'm adding in instead is a lot of setter functions. So setter functions are basically functions that we call to be able to change a value in our app. And so for example, I'm making this change main value function, and it's going to take in the index that a user is on and the new value. And I accidentally made the new value a string. It's supposed to be an int actually, but all I'm doing is tab model index, and then I'm using the index that's applied as a parameter. Main value is equal to the new value. And after that, I do have to call my save data function. And this is because I'm using CoreData. And so we covered how to make that function in a previous reel, but this will make sure that all of my changes are saved properly. After that, I'm just going to repeat this process for every other attribute that my entity has in the CoreData file. So I have a function called change name. I have a function called change increment. I have a function called change reset, and a function called change background color, which uses that extension of BG color that we made previously. And these are part of the logic components that are going to allow me to create the settings page in my app. Happy coding! I found a bug in my app today. So what I was working on is the settings page, and specifically I was trying to use a function I made last time to be able to change the background color. And so this code relies on an enum code background color that we had made previously, and also the function that I added to my view model that we made last time. And I ran my simulator and my app opened up, and at first it seemed like everything is okay because we can click the background color, and as you can see, it changes properly. But as I scrolled to the second page, it wasn't changing. So it wasn't changing the first one, it wasn't changing anything else, it just had no impact on the screen. And when I went to my third page, it not only wasn't changing, but it also was not showing up the settings page. And so this is an error that I'm gonna have to fix, and I think I figured it out though, so join me in the next video to see what I did. Happy coding! If you plan on using a TabView in SwiftUI, you need to watch this reel. So I'm trying to debug some errors in my app, and the first thing I noticed is that one of my functions in the view model doesn't call save data, which means that the data is not going to be saved, it's not going to be updated, and none of it's going to work. But the main problem that I was having last time is that as I was trying to change the background color for my screen, it wasn't updating. And this is because when I'm calling my settings page, I'm passing in the tab index from my loop instead of this selected tab value. And if you don't remember, we made the selected tab value and we binded it to the tab view to make sure that we could always accurately know which screen the user was on. And we're not using it in our code, which is what was causing the error. So once I fix that, I can open up my app, and now everything works as intended. The only issue is that when I open my app, it's starting out on this add page screen, if you noticed, and it's not letting the user access the other pages until they add another page every time they open the app. So this is definitely another error that we have to debug, but I'm really happy that we got this first one done. Happy coding! My SwiftUI app has a bug, but I think that I could solve it. So the issue is that every time I open the app, there's this add page screen that the user has to click to be able to access all the other pages. And this is definitely not ideal. What should be happening is that every time the user closes the app and comes back on, it just starts up from the page that they were last on. But instead, it's forcing the user to make a new page every time they open the app. So my attempt to fix this is that I'm changing my selected tab, which is binded to my tab view, to an @app storage value. And so what this should do is save which screen the user was on, and it should just jump back to that screen every time they open the app. So I'm making this change in my code, and then I'm opening my app back up, but the first time it still has the same issue. So I added another page, and then I tried closing it and relaunching it to see if it was just a one-time thing, but no, we still have this issue, and that means that I'm gonna have to try something else in the next reel. Happy coding! If you can understand this reel, then you can understand CoreData in SwiftUI. So the issue is that every time the user opens my app, they're forced to click this add page button before they can access all the other pages. And I was trying to figure out why this is happening, and so I added a .on appear on my entire tab view, which basically means that the two print statements inside will execute when my app opens. And I printed out the value of the selected tab, which is binded to my tab view and shows which tab the user was on. And that value was 3, and that's correct because that was the tab that I was on when I had last used the app. But the issue was with my vm.tabModelArray.count. And so my tab model array has all the data for my app. And according to this print statement, it has 0 items, which is simply not true if you've been following on for the past couple of reels. So why does it say this? The reason is that inside my view model, in my init, where I'm getting my core data, I'm not calling the fetch data function. And the really important thing to understand here, that when we update our data in core data, it is not directly reflected in our code. The only thing that our code cares about is this @published array that we declared in our view model. And so what the fetch data function does is that it takes the data in core data and assigns it to our array, and then our app is able to use it. But since it wasn't in the init before, every time the app opened, it wasn't being called directly. Instead, when the user clicked the add page button, because that function called fetch data, that's when the code realized that, oh, I have this other data that I need to show. And so once I fixed that, I opened my app, and now it's working as intended. I hope this was helpful, and happy coding. Can you guess what I did wrong in this reel? I'm guessing that if you've been watching this series, you probably will be able to. And my aim for this reel is basically to allow the user to be able to delete a screen from the app. And this is because I've added a lot of pages as I've been testing. And if you'll notice, because when we use CoreData, once we rerun the simulator, our data persists. It doesn't go away. And so that's why I have so many pages. And to fix that, I'm going to be adding in this delete function. So all it's doing is let tab is equal to tab model array index, and then it's doing container container.viewContext.delete, and it's passing in that tab. And this container is the same one that we've been using everywhere else in our code. And in my settings page, after most of the other settings, I'm going to add this delete option because it's currently buried somewhere in the help section, but I think that it should be more clear. And so after I have that code ready, I'm going to run my simulator, and we can see that that button pops up. We do need to format it more, but still, the main issue is that when I click the button, it's not deleting the page. And so once again, this is because there's something that I missed in the function that I made. And let me know in the comments if you can guess what I did wrong. Do you ever make the same mistake twice? Well, that's kind of what I did in my last rule, because I tried to make a function to allow the user to delete a page from my app, but I forgot to call save data after the rest of my code. And if you don't remember, the reason that we need to do this is because the code before just deletes the page from CoreData, but it doesn't save those changes to my app published array. And the app published array is what my code uses to display the UI. So that's why it seemed like nothing was happening. So after I've made this change, I'm going to rerun the simulator. And as you can see, the delete page is now working. And the only issue is that it's not closing the settings page after it deletes. Instead, it's just jumping to the next page. And so that's something I'd want to fix. But also, as I kept deleting pages, I realized that if I deleted the last page, then my app was crashing. And this is something that we definitely don't want. And I'm going to try to debug why this is happening over the next couple of reels. Happy coding! Spoiler alert, this is not going to work. So what I'm trying to do is debug an error that when my user deletes the last page in my app, the app crashes. And this shouldn't be happening. And so before I try to fix this error though, I am just making some changes to the UI of the delete button. And it's just a simple H stack with some text and a spacer. And after that, I'm going to go in my function. And as you can see, I even added a comment saying that we can handle some errors, but we're not going to because we don't need to here. But I think that that wasn't true. And so in order to handle this error, I'm going to be pasting in some more code. And so what this does is it basically checks that if the index being passed in is greater than or equal to tab model array.count, then it just returns and it doesn't execute any of the other code. And so the basis of this is like if you imagine that I have 3 pages in the app, they have indexes of 0, 1, and 2. And so if somebody tries to call like delete index 3 or even higher, then the function would just return and it wouldn't execute any other code. And so after I do this, I'm going to try to run my app. And unfortunately, the issue still persists, which means that I'm going to have to try something else. And I hope that this is kind of just showing you guys that debugging is often a long process and your first try at a solution may not work, but don't get disheartened and just keep going. Happy coding! Will app binding help me solve the error in my app? So the issue is currently that when I delete the last page in my app that has any data, the whole app crashes. And I think that this may be happening because if you try to delete multiple pages, the show settings sheet doesn't disappear in between those pages. And because the very last page in my app is just a button to add a new tab, I'm thinking that it's trying to show the sheet for that page with the button, and that's why it's not working. And so to avoid this, what I'm going to do is pass in with binding a variable that controls whether or not the sheet is shown. And so I'm doing that from my home screen view, and then in my settings page, I'm just making an app binding variable, and then after my function to delete the tab, I'm setting the value that determines whether or not the sheet is shown to false. And so after this, I'm trying to run my code, and I can see that this new logic is working in that if I delete pages from like the middle of the data section, it works and the sheet disappears. But if I try to delete the last page in my app, it is still crashing. And so once again, I'm going to have to try something else in the next reel. Happy coding! I spent over 3 hours debugging my app, and the reason is that I couldn't solve the issue that if I deleted the last page that had any data, then my whole app would crash. And the reason that I found this was happening eventually is that in my ForEach loop, I'm looping on the indices of my array. And so when I delete the last page, the ForEach loop is still trying to get data from that index, even though there's nothing there. So let's say that there's only 4 pages in the app and that somebody's deleting the 4th page, which would be at index 3. Then after the page is deleted, it's still going to try to get components of that page. And when that doesn't work, the app will crash. And I tried to solve this using a lot of different things, including changing the entire implementation of the ForEach loop and using .onReceive and if statements and multiple things. But eventually what I had to do is add in this if statement, which says if tab index is equal to vm.tabModelArray.count -1, then we show this separate code. And this separate code is basically what allows the user to add a new page to the app. And before what I was doing is putting this code after all of my data. But now what I'm basically doing is for the last item in my array, I'm just going to show this code instead of the code that I would normally show for the page. So you can kind of just think of this code covering up what would normally be shown for that page. And also I did have to make sure in my init in the view model that there is always at least one page, because if that isn't true, then when the user first opens the app, they're not going to be able to add any pages. And so what this basically means is that there's always going to be one item at the end of my array that is going to be covered up by this code to allow the user to add a new page. And this is the best solution that I could find without using some very complex binding and things like that. You can read a lot more about this online, but this is how I was able to do it in a way that the animations and everything still work as they were. I want to fix the look of of your sheet in SwiftUI. Over the last couple of reels, our sheet has been looking kind of weird, and the reason is that we're using a presentation dense modifier, and the fraction just doesn't fit with all the elements that we have anymore. And so all I did is I changed that from 0.6 to 0.67, and now as you can see, everything looks a lot better. Happy coding! When was the last time you took out time to clean your code? The last couple of reels have been pretty intensive, and so I just wanted to take a step back today and just emphasize the importance of keeping your code clean. Sometimes we leave in too many comments and add like weird spacing to things and stuff, and that can actually be counterproductive because it just jumbles up our mind when we're trying to write new code. Also, I did want to say that if you want to save a snapshot of what you're doing, I know that Xcode does have history and you can also use GitHub and things like that, but you can also just make a comment at the very end of your code and just save what you have if you're ever making a lot of changes and you're worried you might want to go back a couple steps really quickly. Besides that, what I'm doing is just going in and spacing everything out really well, and also I'm using a shortcut of Command Option and then the left arrow key to close up some of the functions in my view model, and this just helps them take up less space so that they're not as much in the way if we don't need to see the entire code for them. Overall, I just wanted to make this a super light reel, and thank you guys who have been watching this series of building a tracker app entirely on Reels/Shorts. I promise that in the next reel, we're going to get back to coding.